Hi folks, my name is Caroline Erb. I'm an artist and this is my channel. This is my first time recording a voiceover for a video on YouTube, and I'm pretty scared actually. I have really bad phone anxiety, and this is sort of like talking to somebody on the phone. So I'm pretty intimidated. If things are bumpy, please just bear with me. We're learning together. You're my guinea pigs. Today, I wanted to share with you my process for making handmade watercolor paint. This is a hobby I got interested in late last year, 2020, and I was really inspired by Arlisha of Arlie Bean here on YouTube. There's also a few people on Instagram who make handmade watercolors, but watching Arlisha's videos really inspired me because it's so interesting to see how she uses her handmade materials in her own art. And I really wanted to give it a try, so I've been working on handmade watercolor paints for a couple months now. This is maybe my fourth or fifth batch of paint that I've worked on that I'm going to be showing you today. So as you can see, I've put a little toolkit together with everything that I need for making watercolor paints, and I have a small but good selection of pigments that I got from naturalearthpaint.com. Today I'm going to be working with violet ochre. This is a pigment that is actually sourced from the Blue Ridge Mountains here in Virginia, United States, so I think that's really neat. I'm not opposed to working with synthetic pigments, but I am also very interested in working with naturally sourced pigments because they're actually really special. So, how do you make handmade watercolor paint? Well, you really only need two basic parts. The first being your dry powdered pigment like I have here, and the second being your binder solution. Your binder solution is what actually holds these particles of pigment in place and allows them to stick to paper when you use them as paint. Otherwise, if say you just mix pigment in with water and you put it on paper, when that paint dries, your pigment is just going to fall off. So my binder solution is comprised of water, gum arabic, honey, and clove essential oil to deter mold. So every paint maker's binder solution is going to be a little bit different, or you may need a different recipe depending on what pigment you're working with. I don't exactly remember the proportion of ingredients that are in my binder solution, but I'm pretty sure I just used the recipe that is on naturalearthpaint.com for making watercolors. So whatever it says on there is exactly what I did. Safety disclaimer here, if you're thinking about making handmade watercolor paints, you are going to want to wear a mask or a respirator when handling these very fine, possibly airborne, dry pigment particles. So basically, until I've gotten my pigment mixed in fairly well with my palette knife here into my binder solution, I am wearing a mask the whole time. Once I actually get to the mulling process, where I use my glass muller against my glass slab, then I feel comfortable to take my mask off. So what actually happens during the mulling process is that you are encapsulating all of these fine pigment particles inside your binder solution. You're not actually dissolving the pigment into the binder solution. You're not necessarily grinding the pigment down, though that may be the case if you're using some coarser pigments or maybe pigments that you sourced yourself from local rocks and you had to hand grind them. But really, the goal is to make sure that all of the pigment is encapsulated inside of the binder solution so that when you're using this as paint, you're not going to get any fallout from the pigment particles. So I really love using this pigment to make watercolor with. I've used it a few times now, and I've had a lot of success every time, and it's a very interesting pigment. It makes a very interesting paint at the end of the process, and that is really satisfying. Oh, you can see here that I have a little spray bottle of water, and I just use this to spray on my paint when it gets a little bit too thick to mull, because as you're mulling, you will be losing some of your moisture to evaporation. So the violet ochre really only takes me about 20-30 minutes to mull and have the pigment completely encapsulated inside the binder. Some paints are going to be a lot trickier. They're going to take maybe a few hours to work with. It really just depends on the pigment. Again, I would really highly recommend watching Arlicia's videos of Arlie Bean here on YouTube. If you want someone who has a little more experience making watercolor paints, and probably has a lot more detailed descriptions of what she's doing and why she's doing it than I do. I know I'm missing so much information. However, I really wanted to capture the experience of learning this process, especially because it's seeing videos like this by other people that gets me inspired to try different hobbies in the first place. I see somebody try something really neat, and I'd get inspired. I think that's the really positive thing about the internet, and especially about YouTube, is that so much information is so accessible nowadays. Well, it looks like it's swatch time. I think at this point I was probably mulling for about 20 minutes. So really not even very long. So what I'm going to do here is just take a little sample of paint from my glass slab now and test it out on my watercolor paper. The goal of this is both to see, well, what the paint looks like on paper, but also make sure that I'm not getting any granular fallout of the pigment, meaning that I'm not able to pick up any of the pigment particles off of the paper after the paint has been laid down and after it has dried. And you can just test this with like a paper towel. I am cheap, so I used just a couple sheets of toilet paper. A tasty little close-up for you just to demonstrate that the violet ochre paint is very opaque. You can really lay down a thick layer of pigment with it and get a nice dark color. Oh, and along with being cheap, I'm also very impatient, so I just blow dried this real quick, and I'm going to check it by wiping it with toilet paper, and it should come off clean, we hope. Yes, no pigment fallout. Let's check the other one. Wonderful. I'm actually a full-time student, so I don't get a lot of free time to work on this hobby. So these are all half-filled pans of violet ochre from a batch that I made in January, and I'm just going to be filling them up a little bit more today. This is the nice thing about watercolors, is that you can fill up a pan a little bit at a time when you have time to actually work on a batch. You don't have to completely fill up a pan. Now, you do want to dry your pans in somewhere with good ventilation so they don't get moldy, somewhere with low humidity. Hopefully, I live in Florida, so that's not really gonna happen, but you know, I try. The actual dry time for the pans can be anywhere from several days to several weeks. This is why I prefer to fill my pans a little bit at a time as opposed to all the way up. Even if you do fill your pans all the way up and they do dry, eventually you're going to need to refill them because that evaporation that's happening from the paint as it cures is going to lower the level of paint in the actual pan, and it's going to cause a little dip so it looks like you didn't fill your pan all the way. By the way, my boyfriend was making fun of me at this point when I showed him the video because I was trying to get every last drop of paint. Well, I wasn't able to fill up all of those half-filled pans, but I was able to fill up two to the top and another one to about the 3/4 line. Obviously, like I said, I'm going to need to refill those ones that look like they're filled to the top. They're going to shrink and evaporate a little. But what I love about watercolors so much is that a little goes a really long way. So let's see what this paint actually looks like in practice. This is so exciting. So this is a little pan of violet ochre paint that I have been using from my personal palette. And my favorite technique to do with this paint is wet on wet. So where you're adding water to the paper first, and then you're adding the watercolor into it so that it bleeds into the water. And the reason that I like to do this so much is because this pigment actually has... I'm not sure if this is really a proper term for watercolors, but I'm going to call it color separation. This is something that you see happen when you use fountain pen ink to paint with. You will actually see the ink separate into different colors, and that's what I can see happening with this watercolor. There's a lot of granulation too. You can see that the more this paint sits on the watery areas of paper, it starts to collect into little granule areas. This doesn't mean that the paint itself is gritty or anything at all. It's not. It's very smooth. It flows very well in water, but it just has so much character to it, and that's what I really like when I'm using watercolor paint. I don't want something that's going to be perfectly predictable and flat the entire time. I like something that adds a lot of character to my painting, and that is exactly what you're going to get if you use this pigment. It has a lot of character, it has a lot of sass. Another thing that I like about this pigment is that it's very opaque. You don't really see it in this painting because I've only done one layer, but you can get really dark color with this pigment, and here it is dried. You can see that it lightens considerably, which happens with all watercolor, but there's still so much character happening. I just really love this pigment and wanted to share it with you guys. I also wanted to thank you so much for watching, and let me know if this video was interesting or if there's any other questions I can answer about watercolor paint. Take care.